Hello there, welcome back for another week of confirmation. This week we're talking about the period of kings. So we're in the Old Testament, in the middle of the historical books from the Bible that our story comes from, are from 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. We have this period that we call the period of the kings. If you remember, when God set the people up in the Promised Land, the people of Israel, God set them up with judges. And these judges would be the ones that would remind them to follow God's rules, the ways that God had been teaching them to live in the Promised Land. Now God's people have been in the Promised Land long enough that they're trying to figure out, how do we live our covenant relationship the best? What is the best way for us as God's people to live in relationship with God and one another like God wants us to? And there start to be some arguing about how to do this. So in this period of kings, transitioning from judges to kings, God's people, the people of Israel, are fighting. Do we keep the judges or do we need a king? Do we live our best covenant life with a king or without a king? Which one will work out the best? And the people who are arguing that they need a king are saying that they need somebody who can be their leader, who can tell them to follow God's laws. And the people who are arguing no king are saying, well, if we have a king, then we might turn back into Pharaoh's Egypt with this hierarchy of the big deals and the little people on the bottom. And we don't want to return back to that either. So God finally consents and decides to allow God's people, the people of Israel, to have a king. Part of the problem with the judges is that these judges were just normal people. So they were people that screwed things up in big and very important ways. They're not people for us to maybe model our life after, but God also used these imperfect people to do good things in the world, just like how God uses us to do good in this world, despite the fact that sometimes we sin or screw up. So instead of judges, God appoints a king. So it was God and Samuel, the last judge, who picked who was going to be the first king of Israel. And they chose a man by the name of Saul. Now Saul ended up having way too many problems to continue being the king. So the next king that was chosen was David. This is David with the story of David and Goliath. Remember, little David went to go fight the big Philistine giant, Goliath. And David, with a stone, knocked down Goliath and helped the Israelites win the war against the Philistines. It was that David, or David who was friends with Jonathan, that David becomes the second king. David is an important king to know about because it's promised to us by the prophets that from David's throne will become the Messiah someday. So it's important for us to note that once Jesus comes, Jesus is a descendant from King David. So King David begins to rule, and after David comes Solomon. Now, over this period of having kings ruling Israel, God's people forget to live how God wanted them to live, with abundant manna and abundant mercy, taking care of each and every person. They forget that this is what God has called them to do. They forget about this covenant relationship with God, and they fall back into their old patterns. They fall back into easier ways of living. And what happens is they turn out to have Pharaoh's Egypt back again. There's a system where the king is on top, there's these big deals in charge, and then there's people who are at the bottom who become slaves, forgotten about, mistreated, and not taken care of, who are not living abundant manna and mercy lives. This period of kings that our chapter talks about for our chapter today is this period in which God's people are trying to figure out how to live in this covenant relationship with God, but in some ways they've screwed it up and forgotten. But it doesn't mean that God has abandoned them. It just means God is going to have to think of another way to remind God's people to live in this covenant relationship. And that's where we come to the prophets. See you later.